Walking along a path at the foot of Mos Eisley, you wonder if this is where your latest bounty has been hiding. Taking a fork at the moisture farm, you approach that wretched hive of scum and villainy, the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether Han or Greedo shot first. In the corner, by the fire, are three particularly scruffy-looking nerf herders. One of them is me, Matthew Mellema, your co-host, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. Each spring, COVID permitting, you all know the drill by now, we have our big Imagination Redeemed conference, which attracts folks from all across the country. We also have a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. That's right, we're members of a guild, no big deal, whatever. And when the guild isn't creating art, some of us like to podcast. Therefore, Believe to See. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And since you're already doing stuff, maybe rate and review on the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You know by now that helps us a ton, increases the visibility of the show. And like I said, I used to be one of those do as I say, not as I do types. I actually rate podcasts now. Super easy. It's great. I know it helps out the podcast I listen to. So, go ahead and do it. Just do it. But you all didn't come in to hear me talk about that. You came to talk about one of the few good things that's been happening in 2020. But before we get to that, let's bring in our official co-host, El Capitan, oh Captain, my Captain, Master and Commander, Brian Brown, founder and head of the Anselm Society. How you doing, Brian?
And not so closet Star Wars fan. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, happy to do it. Happy to do it. So, Brian, you actually recommended this topic to me a little bit ago. And as soon as you did, it's like, well, obviously we're doing this topic. But for those of us, those the listeners may be newer or aren't as familiar with what you do, why don't you give us a little bit of background on the many things you do for Anselm?
Well, we're a small nonprofit, so a little bit of everything. But the fun space that we're in now, of course, is that we had been heavily events driven prior to COVID. So like everyone else, we're talking about what that means. The nice thing is you can keep podcasting even in the midst of that. But the interesting thing is with a topic like the Christian imagination, you're inevitably caught between these two worlds. You could be super nerds. Let's get the film geeks, the addicts to old books, that sort of thing, like me. But there's a much larger picture to it. And that has to do with the story that Christ invites you into. And that's Christianity. You didn't invite Jesus into your life. He invited you into his. So what does that mean? And how does that have the potential to enchant absolutely everything that you do? So that's the insignificant thing that I get to work with day by day. And sometimes that means banging my head against the wall with grand strategic challenges that are immensely frustrating. And sometimes that means I get to talk about awesome TV shows with you.
There we go. And this is an awesome TV show, not to give my hand away too much. But let's also go to our special guest for this episode, Mike Morea. And those of you who are the more astute listeners will remember we've actually had him on a previous episode to talk about Star Wars. And basically the way we approached it was I thought that the latest trilogy was okay, not great. And the first prequels were garbage. You had the exact opposite opinion, Mike. I should tell you, in light of Rise of Skywalker, I may be coming around to your view, but I don't know. But so Mike Morea, for those of you who don't know, I'll tell you how I know him. We survived first year of law school together, which
we did.
It's sort of like Merry and Pippin surviving the trip down to Gondor together in terms of trauma. And Mike, now you do your own stuff with film podcasts that I really enjoy. So Mike, tell us about yourself.
Thank you. And thanks for having me back. I'm an attorney that's based in California. I met Matt, as he said, in law school, and since then graduated, still working in the law, but I dabble in writing novels. I've self-published 2. The most recent one is called The Ashen Prophecy, which I released 2 months ago, and it's kind of dealing with topics that are relevant to Anselm Society in a way. I mean, I'm definitely nothing close to a C.S. Lewis type or anything like that, but I'm trying to deal with faith issues in like a fantasy context. I think that's a really interesting way to explore allegorical conflicts in the real world and issues of faith. And so my books deal with those topics. And then I also make some short films with friends. We've been making a film series that's kind of a cult hit series here in town called the Precinct series. And additionally, I am the co-host of a long-running film podcast here in Bakersfield, California called Real Perspective. And we talk about how our perspectives, usually our own Christian faith and our worldviews, are influencing how we interpret film. And we go and review usually recently released movies. But since we don't seem to have movies coming out this year, we've also gone on to TV shows. So it's been a broadening, mind-opening experience for all of us.
How do you do a podcast on new movies if there aren't any new movies? The age-old question we never knew we had. So before we are about to get to The Mandalorian, which is a show we all discussed this over email before we start recording. We all enjoy. Mm-hmm. So let's get that on if any of you nerds are chomping at the bit, waiting for us to say something hot takey, no, we like it. But I'm wondering, because we had our previous Star Wars conversation in between Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. In light of Rise of Skywalker, how has that changed your opinion of the later trilogy, if at all? Because seeing the Emperor come back all of a sudden took me aback a little. But Mike, I cede the floor to you.
Oh, so I was someone who was not a big fan of The Last Jedi in the first place. I thought The Force Awakens was a pretty safe, predictable, boring film. And then The Last Jedi tried to do some different things by mostly doing the same things, but then it would do the opposite of what you expect. So therefore thinking that subversion was better than what you were expecting. And I thought that it mostly failed on delivering things that are better than what you expect. I think that subversion can be a good thing when it delivers something greater than what you're thinking it's going to, but not with Last Jedi. And then Rise of Skywalker, you saw this massive overcorrection where they were trying to go and address people's disappointments with various characters and plot lines, but it's coming out the 11th hour. You can't just kind of construct a mini trilogy within one movie to make up for the other two not properly setting it up and not having a plan. And I think you kind of just saw the whole enterprise fall apart with that third movie. It was trying to make up for a lot of lost time in terms of giving characters arcs and journeys and basically the semblance of any sort of plot or overarching connection between any of these movies. And it also failed, I think, as a capstone to what you call the Skywalker saga, or, the 11 film trilogies and all that kind of stuff.
By the way, guys, it was Emperor Palpatine all along, just so you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Brian, you can be the tiebreaker here. My opinion may be changing and they're all bad, but the previous debate, I was saying the latest trilogy was okay, flawed, but, entertaining. And the prequels were garbage. Mike thought that the prequels are, flawed but entertaining, and the latest trilogy was garbage. Where do you come down? You could say they're all garbage. That's an acceptable answer too.
No, it's very interesting because you can read about what George Lucas originally mapped out when he wanted to make 9 films, which he was thinking of doing when he made Episode 4, the original movie. And the story arc that he had planned for the final trilogy actually looked really good. So before he made the second and third films, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Darth Vader was supposed to be the villain for just those 3. And then at the end of the third one, you were supposed to find out that there was an emperor. Mm-hmm. And then the whole last trilogy was supposed to be about that. So I think the most recent trilogy was hilarious because it started out with a classic Disney film. I don't think Disney knows how to tell original stories anymore because most of the movies that they make are it's just like Force Awakens versus A New Hope. It's a shot-for-shot remake of the original. You look at Mary Poppins Returns, and if you were to actually outline Mary Poppins Returns in bullet point form, you realize I just outlined Mary Poppins. The exact same song templates, the exact same plot progressions. That's what they did with Force Awakens. They made a Disney movie of Star Wars. Mm-hmm. Then they got Rian Johnson in to direct the second one. And Rian Johnson is a creative guy, and he looks at that and goes, I don't want to do that. And tries to poke. It felt like the whole movie was just not so much poking Disney in the eye as poking the viewer in the eye just because he could. And, Disney got upset because he wasn't making a Disney movie. And I did not enjoy The Last Jedi either. So they give it back to J.J. Abrams, and what does he do? He goes, okay, well, I have to make another Disney movie. And how many ideas from George Lucas's original plan for episode 9 would still work here? Ooh, the Emperor was going to be in it. And he just starts sticking things in.
And actually, to follow that up, I think something happened with this most recent trilogy that didn't happen with the prequels. The prequels, you saw the world expand, and maybe it didn't go in directions that people necessarily wanted, but there's new concepts there. George Lucas is taking all these kind of different influences from his childhood, like chariot races from Ben-Hur and like in the pod racing and all that stuff. And he's then giving it a Star Wars flavor and therefore expanding the universe. And what you see in the sequel trilogy is Star Wars kind of just eating its own tail and like regurgitating itself.
Yeah.
Like there's no new influences coming in and becoming part of Star Wars. It's just, like, well, we got to have another salt planet or, ice planet fight, or they're in, a Death Star trench run, or there's a super laser, or, that kind of stuff. And it's just becoming so self-referential and meta with itself that it's not introducing anything new. There's no outside influences the way, a Flash Gordon or what we're going to get into, cowboy westerns or Kurosawa or something like that being merged into this world. It's just Star Wars references within a Star Wars movie, which is just not adding anything anymore to itself.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to tee up our conversation now, because I'll emphasize what you guys are saying. One of the several major issues with the latest trilogy is it was sort of collapsing under its own weight. Like there was so much Star Wars baggage where it's referencing itself, and there's J.J. Abrams referencing the original trilogy, then there's Rian Johnson subverting that, then there's J.J. Abrams re-subverting it like this double backflip judo move. And it, like you said, Mike, it just eats its own tail. And there was so much weight, so much pressure to be as epic as possible. It's not just the Death Star, it's Star Killer, which is the size of 100 Death Stars. And it just got so crazy. And it got away from the source material in terms of the original Star Wars trilogy. One of the maybe overlooked things that I think makes the original Star Wars so great is how George Lucas based it off of, the stuff that he loved when he was a kid. We'll get into this more, but Westerns, like the sort of soapy sci-fi TV shows that were on back in the day, Westerns. And it was kind of a love letter to all of those sort of pulpy genres. And that was one of the things that I think was its secret sauce to success. And that is one of the things that I feel The Mandalorian does very well. So we're talking about The Mandalorian and basically how it's, can we say it's the one good thing about the Star Wars franchise right now? And talking about the ways why The Mandalorian works where, the big epic trilogies don't. So, Mike, let's start with you, sort of big picture scheme. How do you feel about The Mandalorian, and what does it get right, sort of big picture, that the more standard episode number Star Wars get wrong?
So where I stand with The Mandalorian is it kind of takes me back to how I felt when I was a kid into Star Wars. And I mean that in the sense of, I think what drew most of us into Star Wars growing up was we wanted to be there. Like we wanted to be a Jedi. We wanted to be like the Han Solo. And that's because of the world building that was done in the original Star Wars movies, especially. We felt like that was like a lived in real place, like in terms of how grimy and run down it was, like on Tatooine or those kind of locations. And it kind of inspired us, our imaginations, to kind of imagine what it would be like to be there. And I think Mandalorian kind of harkens back to that feeling of like a rundown, kind of grimy, dirty galaxy in some ways. That the subsequent movies, you could say the prequels are a little too shiny, or, like in terms of the aesthetics of it. And then the sequel trilogy was just referencing itself again, but like the plot and the aesthetics of it got away from that. And what The Mandalorian seems to do is it just seems to kind of feel like a lived in world, and kind of like harkens back to that sense of adventure that you felt, I think, as a kid, of going on these kind of epic quests. It's almost like video game like in a way, but it works because it harkens back to that 80s style adventure that very few films besides Star Wars, maybe Indiana Jones, maybe some other Spielberg kind of jaunts, got right in the 80s. And like as a society, we don't seem to understand how to like structure a good swashbuckling adventure anymore. I mean, maybe like the original Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that, before that series went off the rails. And I think that that's what really works with the show. And I think it can be boiled down to, the samurai and the Western influences, particularly, and we can get into that some more, but that's kind of where I stand with
totally
why
agree with that.
It works the way it does.
I was watching the first episode of season 2 just, a couple days ago, and my wife was sitting by me. She wasn't really watching him. She was letting me watch it while she did something else. And there are a couple scenes I just looked at, was like, awesome. Yes. And I didn't do that very often during the new trilogy. Brian, same question for you. Big picture, why do you think Mandalorian works when the new Star Wars don't?
I agree with Mike. I think the fascinating thing is, I agree that the prequels felt shiny. There were things about them that didn't feel like Star Wars if you were coming in, what was that, 99? And having been, 20 years away. And the fascinating thing was, I think J.J. Abrams comes along and he makes Force Awakens, and we all kind of responded pretty positively to it. And I think part of the reason was, if you can almost imagine him making this list of what makes something feel like Star Wars. Disney's very good at this point. What makes Mary Poppins feel like Mary Poppins? What makes Pirates of the Caribbean feel like Pirates of the Caribbean? And they make a list of these plot devices and aesthetic elements. And one of the first things he probably zeroes in on is Star Wars is not shiny. Star Wars happens in dirty places with old equipment. And so he gets that right. He does that really, really well. I think when you look at what Jon Favreau and his team do with The Mandalorian, I think they ask the same question, what makes it feel like Star Wars? But instead of asking the aesthetic question first and foremost, I think they asked the existential question first and foremost. We had a conversation with Holly Ordway, a Tolkien scholar, a while back, and I was asking her, I'd actually be curious for your take on this too, Mike, as a fiction writer, but like, how do you write fantasy without sounding like you're trying to write the next Lord of the Rings? And her answer to that question was exactly what you just described George Lucas doing. Like, go back to the existential stuff, go back to the stuff, the deeply true and beautiful things that were the real things that you loved when you were 5 and 10 years old. It wasn't just about the swords. There's a reason you cared about the person holding the sword. And I think Mandalorian does that. It asks the big existential questions about Star Wars. And as a result, it can then play on its own terms.
Actually, I think it's a really interesting point, and I would also follow that up with, I think where the new Star Wars movies have kind of stumbled is on some of those existential questions, like what is the Force? What is like the Jedi? What is like the light side versus the dark side? And I think part of it is a reflection of the writers not really knowing, or maybe having a good understanding of religion in general, or shying away from that topic. And because of that, like the Force storyline in the new trilogy, for example, we got the Rey and the Luke and the Snoke and the Kylo stuff. It doesn't work because it's not really saying anything about good and evil at all in any sort of way, because I think it's afraid to. And I don't know if that's because, the writers themselves aren't spiritual people, and I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone, but it feels like very disconnected and afraid to address those things. And so where I think the new or modern Star Wars does best, and I see this also with Rogue One and with The Mandalorian, is it would avoid that completely and just kind of deal with like average people that don't have to deal with those topics in a way. Yeah. And that way it doesn't have to like kind of half-ass, sorry for the language, issues with the religious aspects. It doesn't feel like they can quite hit that so well in the new trilogy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. And yeah, I think one of the problems with the latest trilogy is this burden of having the scope being the fate of literally the entire galaxy resting on, a few people's shoulders. And you can see that because when that's the scope, everything becomes very significant. Like, I guess, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it by now, but in Last Jedi, there was a twist, sort of a subversion that Rian Johnson does that I actually kind of liked, where there's this big question after The Force Awakens, like, what's Rey's parentage? Is she a Kenobi? Is she a Skywalker? There's all this speculation. And the subversion is she finds out, oh, your parents are nobody. They're just, a couple, scrap traders. They sold you for drinking money. So that was like, oh, that's a subversion. But it's a subversion that's interesting. Like, oh, maybe this great warrior can literally just come from nowhere. Okay, that's an idea. But then, of course, in Rise of Skywalker, it's instantly twisted back like, no. You're Emperor Palpatine's daughter. You're super duper important. It's like, okay, cool. So I guess we don't have a coherent idea on this whole issue. But one of the things that The Mandalorian gets right is its very narrow scope. the fate of the galaxy does not seem to be at stake. There's no chosen one and there's no emperor. There's nothing like that. For those of you who may not be familiar with The Mandalorian, first of all, thank you for sticking around with us this long. But second, the plot of the series is actually really simple to get enough. The Mandalorian is this sort of cool loner bounty hunter guy who's part of this ancient religion, the Mandalorian religion, who are like great warriors. And he's doing a bounty, and he discovers this kid who's Baby Yoda, who maybe, we don't know he's Yoda, that's speculated. He's Yoda species, and he's the most adorable creature created in the past century. And he's just riding around the galaxy trying to help this little Baby Yoda dude. And he has a series of adventures, and it's awesome. Very narrow scope. So, Mike, how does that sort of narrow scope, that sort of limited world, help The Mandalorian, especially in terms of the influences we talked about?
Well, I think it allows the concept to breathe a little bit instead of having to go and juggle 72 different A and B and C plot lines the way the movies do with, an ever expanding cast of characters. It lets this one just be able to sit down for a moment. There's like actual quiet moments in this versus I can't even think of the last Star Wars movie that's had a quiet moment, because it just, you have an hour or 140-minute runtime or something like that. So you have to just keep going, go. And I think the limited, smaller scope helps it focus in on, you have a problem of the week, for example, in some episodes, but then it can go back to the larger plot line of protecting, the Baby Yoda or the child, or whatever you want to call him. I'm going to call him Baby Yoda because I know I'm trying to market him as the child, but come on, he's Baby Yoda.
Until we actually find out that he has a name, pop culture has spoken.
He's Baby Yoda. Let's all be real.
Right. And I think the smaller scope just means it doesn't have to dwell on solving all this mythology stuff that they've set up across all these movies involving, the light side or the dark side, and let them just kind of deal with the characters themselves and let them breathe a bit. And that kind of breathing room means a lot for a TV show, especially to develop its characters. And that goes a long way.
Yeah. And Brian, when you first suggested this idea, I really liked one angle you had in particular, and that was the debt that The Mandalorian owes to classic Westerns and samurai films. And that you can see with what Mike said about the narrow scope, that really lends itself to that. And you can see the influence, right? Yeah.
And I mean, you don't even need any background in either Westerns or samurai films to notice. I mean, the first thing you see in the story is you have a classic saloon scene. And there's just so many little things, camera angles, plot devices. There's Google Mandalorian Westerns and you'll quickly find long lists of little things that they did with episodes. But the beauty of that is that does go back to some of the things that George Lucas had loved as a kid. That's what I love about this. As you watch, Disney Plus has a great making of series on The Mandalorian. It's called The Gallery or something like that. And most of it is just the 5, I want to say, directors of episodes in the first season sitting around a table and talking. And these are really thoughtful people who hung around with George Lucas a lot. And so that when you start talking about hero's journey stuff, when you start talking about the lone gunslinger stuff, the same kind of plot or character element that goes into Han Solo, you see some of that in Mandalorian. But again, it's still not just about the aesthetic. It's not just about the saloon door got kicked in. It's about what was it about those films that you and your parents and your grandparents loved when you were 10 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I can tell you when I watched the first episode of The Mandalorian, and like you said, Brian, it takes place in this classic saloon scene. And you can tell right away, it's like, oh, it's like a Star Wars Western. All right, I'm in, buckle your seatbelt. And they've been keeping that aesthetic pretty consistently. And Mike, I guess a similar question for you. What were the ways that you've noticed the Western and samurai aesthetic, and how has it helped the show?
So, I think one thing that's interesting about Westerns and samurai is they both influenced each other through the development of cinema. You had Kurosawa take notes from the early Westerns, and then the Westerns start taking notes from Kurosawa. Akira Kurosawa, of course, was the one who made Seven Samurai, along with Yojimbo and several other movies. And Seven Samurai became adapted to Magnificent Seven, which is basically the same plot. Is basically you have this group of either samurai or cowboys go and defend a small town against bandits in both of those stories. And similarly, with some of the movies like Yojimbo and others, they became kind of the basis of Sergio Leone, who became the spaghetti Western director of his Man with No Name trilogy starring Clint Eastwood, which, I mean, I would say out of most characters, the Mandalorian himself is based a lot on Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name in terms of kind of not really having a name. I know he has a name, like as a Mandalorian, but right, it's a man with no face, exactly. And both American and Japanese cultures, I think, found something in terms of, obviously there's some aesthetic differences between them, but it's the idea of like a lone warrior, be it a cowboy or a samurai, kind of establishing order in maybe a lawless land. And in the case of the Western, it was in terms of like this untamed frontier that was lawless. And then in terms of Japanese samurai films, it was this idea of the samurai usually sometimes after like a samurai without a master who's kind of wandering, establishing order in like a feudal Japan setting. And, there's some different contexts for both of them. But the idea, I think, translates very well into what The Mandalorian does as well, because you're dealing with a time period in terms of the show of like after Return of the Jedi. And so the Empire's fallen, and now there's kind of this vacuum of power, and you see kind of more a criminal elements or these imperial remnants, from the Empire falling, kind of vying for power. And then you have this lone gunman who kind of has like a hardened heart, but slowly has it melt, which is, the subject of a lot of different movies, and especially cowboys and samurai movies. And he kind of learns to protect and value life a little bit more. And so The Mandalorian, I think, can draw upon those pretty readily because the setting of Star Wars itself lends itself to it very well. And in fact, we can talk about maybe some of the other movies that are big influences on it, but there's a series that I came across about, I want to say like 3 or 4 months ago, called Wolf and Cub. There's like 6 movies in this Japanese series, and it came like the first one came out to America called Shogun Assassin. I think it was like a re-edit of the first 2 Wolf and Cub movies. But basically, this idea of like this guy was a former shogun executioner during like a particularly brutal period of the Japanese shogunate, and he walks away from that, and then he's kind of this wandering guy. He's like, his wife has died and all that stuff, and he has like a small child that he is raising, and he has like this stroller, and over the course of the series, like he's protecting his child, his son, and the son starts kind of getting involved in like the fights that he gets involved with because he kind of goes from town to town taking on odd jobs, and then like the stroller that he moves his baby around in like gets kind of outfitted with weapons too. It kind of gets wild actually, but I see a lot of similarities in that and the Mandalorian protecting Baby Yoda and Baby Yoda kind of assisting sometimes in the Mandalorian. So I would like to know how much Favreau, who created the series, really saw of that. But I imagine he's a pretty big film buff. He's probably seen it, and you see a lot of that kind of elements within the Mandalorian.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, I'm guessing there are some other elements you picked up on, but what were the samurai and Western like motifs or tropes that you saw the Mandalorian pick up on?
I'm positive I do not know as much about either Westerns or samurai films as Mike does. But so one of the ways in which there's a ton of ways, like Mike said, in which the 2 genres influenced each other. One significant way, I think, in which they tend to be different is that while they both have that lone gunman type character, usually in Westerns, the lone gunman type character is the lawman, the representative of order. And there's this sense that, the world's a lawless place and he's there to fix that, which has this sort of inherent sense of hope to it, even in fairly dark movies. And I would say by contrast, the samurai films that I've seen, it's usually the opposite dynamic. The world used to be ordered. It used to be beautiful. And the samurai or the lone gunman character is the last representative of that. And there's a much more hopeless dynamic, more of a sense that you're on your way down rather than up. And it seems like, it felt to me like The Mandalorian is this really interesting hybrid of the 2, because the galaxy seems to be kind of on the way down, seems to be getting worse in a lot of ways. And that's especially true if you know where the future's going with the new trilogy. And you've got this main character who is pretty much part of that system. He's a bounty hunter. He's done lots of bad things. So he's not a representative of law. He's not a representative of I'm going to fix all of this. But then he encounters this child in the situation where he's going to presumably result in the death of this child. And he just looks at this situation and no, line in the sand. It stops here. And so it's less that he's a representative of law, it felt like, and more representative of morality, of like good and evil as a thing. So it's almost like by removing those stakes that we talked about earlier, by not forcing this film to carry the high stakes of capital G versus capital E, you actually create this fun Western samurai hybrid space where the character can actually wrestle with it on some level.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's like a really good point. And additionally, I think you see kind of the influence of American and Japanese recent historical experience play a role in how they viewed things a little slightly differently. Like, for example, Brian, you're talking about how the world's kind of broken in a samurai film because you're coming off the back, particularly when a lot of samurai films were being made out of World War II, where, the Japanese empire had been defeated, versus on the other hand, with cowboy movies, you see America is kind of feeling pretty confident and good about itself and its own history after World War II. And so there's almost like a more triumphalist, American society is being built in the West right now, and it's more hopeful. And I do agree with you that The Mandalorian kind of shows an interesting balance between the two. And you see some of that in how it's adapting the movies, the samurais and the Western movies that it's adapting. Like we're talking before, The Magnificent Seven is a little more of a triumphalist movie, actually, than Seven Samurai. And like Seven Samurai, it's a lot of samurai pass away at the end, and it's kind of like a mournful, sad passing away of the old order of samurais defending people. Versus Magnificent Seven is a lot more hopeful. And I kind of see, I think it's like episode 4 of the first season in Mandalorian, Mando and a female character, Cara Dune, go and defend this village from an ATST, that big Imperial Walker. And they teach the villagers how to fight and all that. And so that's very much a Seven Samurai, Magnificent Seven ripoff right there. But the ending's a lot more hopeful, and it's kind of based more on the American sensibility of it. So it's interesting what they decide to go and take from both of those genres.
Yeah, and something I think that The Mandalorian has going for it too, and I think you both touched on this, is it can sort of go back and forth between that more samurai sensibility and the cowboy sensibility from episode to episode, because in certain aspects you can see The Mandalorian as like the last samurai, because he's a member of the Mandalorian, basically a religion more than anything, and they have this very strict code of conduct. They're legendary warriors. They have this awesome armor, but he's one of the last of his kind by the time this is going on. And the Mandalorians are basically, they're warriors of legend. You don't really assume that they're really around anymore. So in that sense, it really fits into the Japanese narrative that we were talking about with the samurai. But in other senses, there's some episodes where, like you mentioned, Mike, with the Cara Dune episode where they're fighting the ATST, or, the first episode of season 2, where they're sort of going into this, frontier and trying to impose their order on us. They can really work well with that. Well, Mike, you were mentioning Seven Samurai, Magnificent Seven. Definitely see those vibes. And I'm glad you brought up, what was it, the Wolf and Cub?
Yeah.
I was just reading articles on this subject, and that one came up, and I just thought that was fascinating. One of the movies I watched over the weekend, my wife very graciously agreed to watch it with me for research for this episode, was Yojimbo, which was classic samurai film directed by Akira Kurosawa, starring Mike, let me know if I'm butchering the name, but Toshiro Mifune, who's awesome. And you can see the vibes not only of the Western and how it was influenced and did influence, but you can also see that with The Mandalorian, because the plot of Yojimbo is really simple. It's this sort of lone samurai without a master, just sort of wanders into town, realizes there's these two gangs who are causing trouble, and decides, with no real prompting, like, cool, I'll kill all the gang people and free the town. So that's, spoiler alert, that's what he does. And then at the end, he's like, all right, cool, well, see you guys later. And he, like Mando, he's a good guy, but he has a complicated moral code. Like, he'll kill bad guys, pretty much without thinking about it. He doesn't come across as a nice guy, but you could tell he has a very firm moral center. And that's one of the things that I really find fascinating about The Mandalorian is they really are exploring this classic lone cowboy, this classic samurai. Brian, what were ways that you noticed that they sort of developed this character of Mando who's wearing a friggin' helmet for almost the entire time, and we don't know his
I was
name?
really hoping you were going to ask about that.
What were your thoughts about how they developed this character who's wearing a helmet and we don't even know what his face looks like?
I mean, I just think it's so brilliant, especially in the context of Star Wars, because get this, Rian Johnson, it's a subversion. It flips the script. In Star Wars, the bad guys are supposed to wear masks. And traditionally in film in general, you don't want the heroes wearing masks, even the ones that are, old, like dogfight, fighter pilot type stories. I always find a way for the hero to be wearing a helmet or goggles that are, don't cover quite so much of the face, because you need to be able to see somebody's eyes, to look into their soul, to empathize with them, to feel like this is the good guy. This could be me. And to pull that off with a character whose face you don't see is just remarkable to me. And I think that quiet moral center is part of it. They do things with silence and pauses in the movie that just allow you to pause and actually process, instead of just looking at the face and go, oh, he's upset. His face looks upset. You actually have to process, how would I feel in this situation? And if you don't pull that off, you are not going to care about this character. The audience is not going to care. But I think they largely do pull it off, with the result that in those moments, you're almost going through the thought process with him. Should I do this thing? He's in so many either or type situations where it's, do I do this wrong thing or this wronger thing? And you just kind of process that with him. I also think I'll pause. We can circle back to the other thing I was going to say. What do you think about that, Mike?
Well, I agree with you. And I think the strongest episodes of the show are the ones where he has someone to bounce off of because of like a conflict in ideology or philosophy or something like that. Because his character himself, I like his character, but he's a bit of a blank slate. You can kind of like almost make him an audience insert in a way, which I kind of think enhances like the fantasy and adventure aspect, because that's kind of harkening back to what I was talking about, like where it makes you kind of feel like a kid who likes Star Wars again, because you can kind of imagine yourself like being him. But he definitely has like a personality and values that I think are important. But I think where they become most fleshed out in the best episodes of the show is when he's interacting with like a Cara Dune, or when he's interacting with, I don't remember the Apollo Creed actor's name, Carl Weathers. Yeah, his character. Yeah.
Carl Weathers?
He's interacting with Apollo Creed. When he's interacting with other people, other bounty hunters and people who maybe like know him or know of his reputation, or even him just bouncing off of Baby Yoda. I mean, that's a big part of what makes his character appealing, is his concern and his growing mutual, respect for the baby. I think that's what really goes and fleshes him out the most. And those are usually the most compelling episodes of the show. Like, for example, I mean, I know we weren't going to go into too many spoilers with this season so far, but it's been very monster of the week kind of type deals so far, and those have been like excellent for spectacle, and I've enjoyed them. It hasn't like the first episode, for example, allowed him to go and really play off of like one bounty hunter type character, and I think that was what was the most compelling part of it. So I think the way his character is set up is kind of like a rich minefield for other characters to kind of talk about their roles in the Star Wars universe, and that also fleshes him out as well.
I hadn't thought about that. It strikes me that another way that we benefit from that dynamic is that the characters that he's bouncing off of, so to speak, tend to fall into one of two categories. People who are trying to figure out who they are, or trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, or people who are very, very sure and wrong. And in either of those dynamics, the strong silent type provides this sense of kind of a moral center for the show, as everyone else tries to sort out right and wrong and who they want to be and what action they're going to take.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that, the best episode of the series so far is kind of like the last two episodes of the first season, where there's kind of like this almost coalition or mini family forming with various characters, and Mando even learns to respect robots and that sort of stuff. And I think the ensemble like nature of those like last two episodes in the first season just kind of gave it a different dynamic that helped his character along with all the other characters, and kind of brought the themes of that season home, which is that Mando can't just be like a loner. He needs to find like people that he, maybe not even other Mandalorians, but people who share his values and want to protect life, or at least protect the baby Yoda's life. And that's what I thought was really great about that last episode of the first season.
Yeah, I agree. I thought the last 2 episodes per season were super good. You know, they did tie everything together. I love the getting the gang together thing. That even gets into some like old Western samurai tropes. But I think getting to what you two were saying about the appeal and the resonance of Mandalorian, of Mando, we're just a few weeks removed from Halloween. I don't know about you. I was scrolling through Facebook to see everyone. Seems like every single kid, age 12 and under, dressed up as Mando, had the Mandalorian helmet. Every single baby was dressed up as Baby Yoda. I like them all. They were adorable. But you can see watching that as a kid, like I'm looking forward to sharing this in a few years with my kids when they're old enough, where it's like, yes, I want to be a Mandalorian. This is just cool. This sort of childlike wonder that it's so great to have that back in Star Wars. So I want to switch gears a little bit. We're kind of winding down on time, and I want to hit on this. But this is another point you brought up, Brian, and I think it's really interesting. And that's just the tech aspect of this, how it was filmed, the technology that makes this allowable, and just the consequences for that moving forward. So tell us what you were thinking about the impact that the new tech has on The Mandalorian.
So I'm curious to know what you guys think, because I'm not wedded to this, but looking at the way that the different sort of chapters of Star Wars have been shot is interesting to me, because of course you have, mostly practical effects. It's either really, in the original trilogy, it's either really happening or they're going to add it in some way that's actually physical. Mm-hmm. So the actors are doing what actors have always done. They're acting off of real other people and real props and real costumes and on real sets. And then, of course, George Lucas went totally crazy with pushing the boundaries of new technology with prequels, and just, every behind the scenes shot you see is like Ewan McGregor in a Jedi costume with a bunch of green. And in fact, there was one of the Mandalorian making ofs, Dave Filoni, one of the directors, goes on this 5 or 6 minute just storytelling binge towards the end of one of the episodes, and they just filmed the whole thing uninterrupted and let you watch it as he talks about what George Lucas was trying to do with the prequel trilogy, which I got a ton out of. Usually it's in the first episode or 2 of the making of. You should go watch it, people, if you haven't. But he talks about what the decision making and moral focus, the things that are riding in the balance of certain scenes in the prequels that I definitely did not pick up on watching the prequels. So I think, going back to something that Mike said last time he was on the show, there were like good stories, good ideas, not always well executed. But because there's so much distraction, there's so much stuff that your eyes and your brain are distracted by, that you're not focusing on the characters and the people, which is a huge part of what made the original great. Well, this one is, they're pushing the boundary of technology again. They're using some technology that they pioneered with, Jon Favreau pioneered with Jungle Book and Lion King, quote unquote, live action remakes, and kind of completed with this. And it's called The Volume, if I remember correctly, is what they call it. And it's basically this huge circular TV screen around a stage. And if they're going to do a set shot or an on location shot, instead of going on location or instead of building a full set, they go somewhere with some cameras. They get the shots that they need to do this computer generated world. I mean, the same way that you do making a video game scene that you can walk around in. And they use that as a backdrop, and then they build a small set. And at that point, all the filmmaking is done around the human actors, the usually 1 or 2 or 3 human actors on a small set. And it's a digital backdrop. You'd never know that watching the show. You'd swear everything you're seeing is an on-location shot. It's all done on a stage. But instead of green screens, it's an environment that they can interact with. And it forces the filmmakers to have this focus on the humans, on the actual characters. That's my gut anyway. They don't actually say that in any of the interviews that I've seen, but I have to figure if I just basically have almost a film equivalent of a stage with a backdrop, I'm probably going to focus on the characters on stage, and I'm going to put a lot of love and a lot of attention into why I should care about those people and what they're doing.
That's an interesting point. I would also approach it from another angle, which is, I obviously go and direct some short films and I act in them. And I think for the actors, it's also very freeing because you're not having just been told by the director, okay, this is what it's going to look like. So kind of act like this or something like that. They actually see visually on the set what the environment's going to be like, what they're interacting with a lot more. And so there's less guesswork. And, I think that maybe where Lucas fell short sometimes with the CG or the green screens of the prequels is that he's not a very good communicator to his actors in terms of like conveying information to them and like what this is going to look like eventually. But this kind of removes that problem. And so it frees up the actors' minds a little bit. I mean, not to say that like they can't be imaginative, but they can be imaginative about how they're acting versus like how this looks in post or what the heck they're even talking to, in this scene, and like how many variations that's going to go through. So I think that part of it helps the show quite a bit, and then the other part of it is it lets the show feel so much bigger than a TV show does. I mean, there's some visuals in this show that I'm like, wow, like this is on a TV budget. I mean, obviously they spent like movie level budget on it, but I'm just constantly impressed by the visuals they pull off on this thing. Like there was some stuff, particularly in the second episode of the second season, that was just like in terms of like them flying by locations and all this stuff where I was just blown away. And I think that's what really makes it feel like a Star Wars show, because they could have made something, and George Lucas tried to make a Star Wars TV show about 10 years ago. And then the budget would just be astronomical to pull it off at the time. And, the stuff like the volume wasn't quite there yet. And so they had to go in and scrap it and just kind of like shelve it for a while. And finally, I think the technology of even just a TV production has reached the point where we can have movie quality visuals and scale and scope that couldn't be achievable before. So just on that like front alone, I mean, the volume is just an immeasurable help to this show feeling credible and like, a Star Wars movie in a way.
Yeah, I think it cost I think I saw it somewhere, it cost like 10 million an episode to make that. But I wonder how much that was once you subtract the cost of actually building the volume. Because at this point that's built and they're renting it out to other studios to use.
Yeah, actually, and my understanding is that like this season, I think it maybe had an increase in budget, but from last season, but a lot of last season's budget went toward just producing that. So now they're so much more freed up to go and do more with, the set design or the visuals themselves rather than the set construction.
That's one of the things I am, optimistic of going forward, is seeing how the technology is used in aid of the story. Where, like with the prequels, okay, I like to dump on it. It's a bad habit, but you can see what George Lucas was trying to do. But it ended up looking like he was trying to show off the technology rather than use it to aid the story. And, the technology just wasn't there yet. And now looking at the prequels, it looks like the characters are walking around in a, Nintendo 64 video game. But now, whether it's tech advances, I'm sure that's part of it, or else it just looks like the directors here are focused on the characters and the technology aids the characters rather than the other way around. And I am really hopeful for this going forward. Like, I'm actually hopeful that we can have more, stories like this in the Star Wars universe, where they're kind of small stories. They're not on the galaxy-defining scale, but they're like characters. Like, let's see an Errol Flynn-style swashbuckler with like a average Joe Jedi. It doesn't have to be the chosen one, just an average Jedi. Let's see some of this other stuff. So I'm really excited. I'm super psyched about watching the rest of this Mandalorian season. And yeah, I'm really excited into trying to dress up one of my children as Baby Yoda next Halloween. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We're actually over time. I would love to talk more about samurai and cowboys and Mandalorians, but we are out of time. So Mike and Brian, thank you so much. Before we go, Mike, where can we find you?
So you can go and find my podcast, Real Perspective, that's co-hosted by my friend MJ Smith. It's on SoundCloud, on Stitcher. I mostly use SoundCloud for that one. And you can go and find my books, the most recent one, which is The Ashen Prophecy, on Amazon, as well as the previous book, The Aurora War, on Amazon. It's available in paperback and Kindle editions. And I'm trying to work on some more projects in the meantime, but also, I guess, my short films are the Precinct series. They're on YouTube. They're definitely a little dorkier than some of the other stuff that I'm working on, but they're fun. They're fun movies, and I try to put like my criticisms of movies in my podcast into my own works. I try not to be a hypocrite, and I try to learn from my own experiences and how I evaluate films. So they all kind of tie together.
Awesome. And let me also assure you, Mike, Believe to See is a safe place. You never have to apologize for being dorky. So that is totally up our alley. Don't worry.
I thank you for that. And thank you for having me on, both of you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you again, both of you. And, well, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Untitled Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers. Customers are trundling home. And you polished off your final glass of that weird blue milk that they drink in Star Wars. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Untitled Society. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.